Alrighty, team, let's go ahead and continue on our conversation about language. Right, yesterday we talked about the stages of language acquisition, as well as kind of the breakdown of the organization of language in terms of like phonemes, morphemes, and syntax and semantics, right? And now we're going to shift our attention to people who have studied language and what they view language to mean in our understanding of the world. So we kind of have like two guys here that have different perspectives on what language is. And we're going to kind of reference this idea in the framework of nature versus nurture. So you have Noam Chomsky, who says that all languages share some basic elements called universal grammar. He says that humans are born with a built-in predisposition to learn grammar rules. It happens so naturally, training hardly helps, right? So this is that idea of nature. We are born with the inherent ability to acquire language. We don't really have to try that hard, okay? Benjamin Lee Whorf, on the other side, has come up with this idea of the linguistic relativity theory. This says that the language a person speaks influences how they think. Now, I have linked this TED Talk that's referenced here by Keith Ken. I linked it in the supplemental materials slide on the homepage of Canvas. If you are interested, I suggest watching it. It talks about how he, being a Chinese boy from the Midwest in the United States, learned to speak Mandarin and English, and he basically said that like Mandarin and a lot of other languages don't identify time as the United States does. So like in the United States, we say it was raining, it is raining, it will rain, which if we continuously disassociate the future from the present by saying that it will rain, right, and clearly having a distinction between the future and the present, right, we're going to be less likely to save our money for that future, right? Whereas futureless or languages that don't distinguish between that timing, in Mandarin, essentially what they say is it did rained, it rained, it is rained, and it's going to rain, or whatever. They don't like change the tense. It associates their future and their present, and so it makes it easier for them to save. Anyway, it's a very interesting idea, but I think that's a really good example of how language defines time and how we use language to explain that, and how then that influences how we think. We're going to look at a couple of more examples of this, but again, that's the linguistic relativity theory, and that was pronounced by or determined by Benjamin Lee Whorf, and that's in contrast to Noam Chomsky's like nature versus nurture debate that everyone's born with the propensity for language, right? Like we all learn language. It's innate. It's a reflex. It's built in, right? He essentially said, as we've referenced, right, this idea that you don't really need to work very hard to acquire language. The other side of the spectrum then of that nature versus nurture, right? Chomsky would be nature. We're born with this innate ability. B.F. Skinner would be more nurture, right? This idea that a much more productive view is that verbal behavior is behavior. It has a special character only because it is reinforced by its effect on people, right? This idea of our parents speak language, so we learn language. And when we speak language back to our parents, they cheer for us and they say, "Yay, little Sarah, you said mama, you said water, you said doggy, good job." And we continue that reward cycle. And then later on in life, if we communicate our feelings and our sentiments, we might get what we want. We might get a raise if we're able to articulate why we deserve a raise, right? We might be able to connect with a partner because we're able to explain our feelings, right? And so B.F. Skinner would argue that reinforcement is what's influencing our acquisition of language. So these are just like three of the perspectives. And like I said, we're going to look at the linguistic relativity theory here in a little bit more detail and look at some more examples before going into the effect that brain damage has on language acquisition. But it is important to recognize that different psychologists believe different things about why and how we acquire and use language. One thing that most psychologists agree upon, though, is this idea of critical periods. And the reason being is there was a young girl named Jeannie who was kept in a basement. Obviously, this was an extreme situation of child abuse, but she was kept in her basement for years. Not really talked to, not played with, only given food and time to go to the bathroom. We're going to watch a short little video clip on her. But this idea of critical periods is that it is easier to learn a language the earlier in life you start speaking it, right? It is important to begin appropriate language exposure or education early so that the language centers of the brain continue to develop. Language might not ever develop if not begun by age 7. So again, we're going to look at Jeannie. She's an example of somebody who tries to start learning language after age 7. But this critical period is important, and it actually goes against Noam Chomsky's idea that like we're all born with this innate ability to learn language. Well, if we wait too long, if there's too much time between being born and when we start to acquire language, right, like there's going to be issues. And this holds true too for bilingualism. And this is part of the argument for why people believe that like immersion schools are so important, because the younger you start being acclimated to and exposed to a language, the easier time your brain is going to have acquiring that language. So when kids are in Mandarin immersion at, I don't actually know if Wayzata has a ton of immersion schools. I know Minnetonka does. Actually, my second grade teacher that I had at Groveland Elementary School, the first and best elementary school in the Minnetonka School District. My second grade teacher, Miss Dano, is a part of the Spanish immersion program. And they say that like if kids start being exposed to Spanish when they're in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, right, by the time they're adults, it's a lot easier to retain that knowledge. Whereas a lot of us go to college, we try to learn another language, we study abroad for a term or a semester or whatever, but that language doesn't stick with us very long. So if we're thinking about kind of that memory piece and how transferring or encoding information from our short-term to our long-term memory, that's a more permanent transition or transduction if we're younger than if we're older. So like I said, here we're going to watch just a short video on Jeannie. They call her the wild child because she was not given any human interaction for the first, I can't remember, I think it was 7 or 8 years of her life. Again, she was kept in a basement room. She had like a potty seat in her room. She was given food, but she wasn't played with. She was chained naked to a chair or a bed, and she didn't have any interaction. And so this just gives insight into what that critical period really can do in terms of influencing a person's, I dropped my pen, a person's ability to acquire language. So here you go, watch this, and then we'll chat about it real quick.
In 1970, in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles, a harrowing story came to light. It would change forever our understanding of how a child's brain develops. A social worker discovered a 13-year-old girl who was still in diapers and whimpered like an animal.
Clearly something was terribly wrong. She didn't speak. She was completely unkempt. She could hardly walk. She could hardly balance.
Jeannie, as the child was named, had suffered a most horrific ordeal.
We learned after she was found from interviews with her mother, from some drawings that Jeannie made, that she had been kept isolated in a room at the back of a house. In this room there was a potty seat to which she had been harnessed without any clothes, just naked, and left to sit there day and night. She was in this room for 12 and a half years.
Jeannie's father was mentally unstable. He had decided to hide his daughter from the world.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charges. We haven't even seen them.
Jeannie's parents were both charged with willful abuse. 15 minutes before he was due in court, her father put a gun to his head. But the damage to Jeannie was done. She had spent her childhood in almost total isolation. Her brain had been deprived of a nurturing environment and left to grow in solitude. The effect was devastating. Jeannie had the mental age of an 18-month-old infant, unable to talk. But to science, she offered a unique opportunity, a chance to separate the effects of nature and nurture on a child's brain. The big question was, would Jeannie be able to catch up? Susie Curtis was a young linguist when she got the job of looking after Jeannie 5 days a week.
Food is for. She was hard to be with. She did not know how to swallow very well, so she would salivate and just spit. So I would come home drenched in her saliva. There were lots of things that were very, very difficult and unpleasant, but nonetheless, she was just entirely captivating. The way she moved her hands, the way she just moved her body and her face, her eyes, that just seemed to be incredibly expressive and hold the world within them.
Susie soon discovered that Jeannie was highly intelligent and extremely curious about the world.
I was really hopeful because she was just insatiable. She wanted to know the word for everything. And her assumption was that everything had its own label. Every shade of color had its own label. And so she wanted to learn the label for everything in her world. It's dark, yes. She continued to develop a huge vocabulary. I could no longer keep track of what she knew. And she continued to be able to string words together. Buy applesauce store, or buy more applesauce store, which meant buy more applesauce at the store. Let me see, the log? But the little bits and pieces of English that take those words and transform them into a grammatical sense never came in. All the question words like who, what, where, why, when, never. She never had any of them. Pronouns like he, she, it, they, him, her, not in her vocabulary.
Here, you do it. Put them in the box.
And so despite all the years that I was with her, where I saw lots of growth in lots of other areas, she didn't ever learn the grammar of English.
Jeannie never worked out the fundamental rules of language. Her brain had missed a critical stage of its development. In the first years of life, the main job of the brain is to make sure all the brain cells are wired up correctly. Surprisingly, it's not just a matter of making connections, but cutting them. A 3-year-old has twice as many connections between brain cells as a grown-up, and they're jumbled and chaotic. To work properly, the brain must decide which connections to keep and which ones to cut. Trillions of connections need to be checked. So the brain uses a brutal but effective rule. Use it or lose it. Because Jeannie's parents hardly ever spoke to her, the parts of her brain responsible for grammar were not stimulated and were crippled for life. Jeannie's story did not have a happy ending. She went through a string of foster homes, was abused in one of them, and stopped talking altogether. She now lives in a care home in California. Jeannie's experience was extreme, but her case taught science that once a critical window of brain development has passed, there is no going back. A growing brain is both vulnerable and extreme.
So there's Jeannie's story. Obviously not a happy ending, but a case study, right? Again, thinking back all the way back to Unit 1, and the different types of psychological studies that we do. We can't intentionally harm somebody or intentionally keep a child from learning language for the first X amount of years of their life. That would be very traumatic and detrimental to their well-being. So we rely on these case studies such as Jeannie's to understand what that critical period really means and the impact that it can have. So obviously she was unable to grasp the grammar, the syntax of putting sentences together. She had minor semantic understanding, but that was it. And that's because she missed that critical period of language development. So with that said, we're going to kind of circle back then to linguistic relativity theory, and how time kind of fits into that. I referenced the idea of saving money and how having like a future language, a language that references the future as separate from the present, can hinder one's ability to save. But here are just a couple of other kind of examples if we're thinking about which ways in which we think, how that actually influences the language that we use, right? So if you think about spatial metaphors, and we're talking about like the past and the future, we're going to like physically point. If we're talking about the future, we'll point to like in front of us, right? And then the past will like point behind us. I'm like physically sitting here, like pointing like a crazy person. But in languages, in some other languages, they reference like the future as behind them because it's unknown, and the past as in front of them because it's what they can see, right? If you're looking at that Vietnamese kind of South American culture, come on, right here, the past is known, and so we point forward, or the past is known, yeah, so we point forward, and the future is unknown, so we point behind us, right? Looking right versus left. And while this doesn't really seemingly have that big of an impact on our lives, like it does in how we conceptualize how we speak and how we explain the experiences that we go. Think about like kissing, right? This is a kind of funny example, but it's true, right? When cultures read from left to right, about 2/3 of the couples lean their heads to the right, right? And, right? 77% of Hebrew and Arabic language speakers who read from right to left actually kiss by tilting their heads to the left, right? Again, this idea how we interpret language, how we take in language, whether that's by reading, writing, speaking, signing, whatever, how we interpret that and take that in is going to influence our behavior and how we think and then we act. So just kind of again, like an interesting comparison here, but really we want to clarify this linguistic relativity theory that was presented to us by Benjamin Lee Whorf, right? In that like the language we speak influences how we think. Yeah? So real quick, this is fun. Can you think of something that doesn't have a name in English? Can you think of anything? It's always hard when they like ask you right off the top of your head. Well, this idea is actually called a sniglet. So sniglet is a term for a word or a thing or a noun or a verb or whatever that doesn't actually have a name in the English language. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. You can look these up online. They're super funny, but they're things that you don't really think about. Aeropolmics is the study of wind resistance conducted by... the study of wind resistance conducted by holding a cupped hand out the car window. We've all done that before. Woohoo! Bacon, fake bacon bit served at a salad bar. That's one of my favorites. Zerblot, the last kid picked on any neighborhood sports team, right? Express hole. Oh, this one's a good one. We've all had an express hole. A person who goes through the grocery store's 12-item express lane, but with 22 items. Yeah, right? So these are examples of sniglets, right? And it's interesting because there are, if you yourself are bilingual, or if you have friends or family who are bilingual or speak a different language, you'll realize that English and other languages don't always directly translate or correlate certain words to be the same thing, right? And so sniglets are just like another example of the influence that language and our acquisition and use of language have on how we explain what's going on around us. And that's kind of where we're going to end that conversation, right? What is language? How do we use it? How is it organized? How do we learn it? And how do psychologists interpret it? So that's big picture. We're going to shift our attention now to brain damage and language. I'm specifically focusing on Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, which we referenced a little bit when we talked about the brain and neurobiology and the specific areas of the brain that deal with language. So brain damage and language obviously go hand in hand in many regards. Oftentimes we see aphasia of two specific areas, or not aphasia of, but aphasia is an impairment in language production or comprehension brought along by neurological damage. But this damage is generally happening in either Broca's aphasia, in Broca's area, or Wernicke's area. And you'll see kind of where those are located here on the brain. Broca's area specifically controls speech muscles via the motor cortex. So this is the actual like action of speaking. I'm sitting here like over enunciating and moving my mouth a lot because that would be controlled by Broca's aphasia, whereas Wernicke's aphasia is the interpretation, right, of auditory code. So interpreting the meaning behind the words being said. And so we're going to look at what exactly Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia are, and then we'll watch a couple of videos of examples of the two different types of aphasia. Again, aphasia being an impairment in the ability to produce or understand language, usually caused by damage to the brain. Generally speaking, that damage is caused by a stroke of some sort in which the area of the brain did not get enough blood for X amount of time, thereby damaging permanently the brain cells that are there. And so many of the people that we will see demonstrating these types of aphasia are stroke victims. And so when we talk about Broca's aphasia, again, remembering that Broca's area controls speech muscles via the motor cortex, damage to this area generally leads to difficulty putting words together into sentences, and we often see these people singing in single words. People with Broca's aphasia can generally still write sentences and write letters. They can also generally sing songs because research has shown that the neural pathways to creating, putting together lyrics and singing those lyrics are different neural pathways than actually coming up with new speech and coming up with your own sentences and language. So we'll see, like I said, an example of that. But remember, Broca's aphasia is difficulty putting words together, right? Choppy language, but generally speaking, you can probably decipher some of the meaning because the words are used in the right context. Whereas in Wernicke's aphasia, we see difficulty comprehending speech and producing coherent speech. And people who have this type of aphasia are not easily monitoring one's own speech to make sure it makes sense. So again, let's watch these two examples. One is of Broca's aphasia, and then the second is this cute little old man on a cruise. He's so cute. But anyway, he has Wernicke's aphasia, and he's just so happy, but you can tell the meaning gets all jumbled. Whereas in Broca's aphasia, it's more broken speech and the inability to put language together. They understand language, and they understand what they're trying to say, and they can still write language, but producing that language, because Broca's aphasia is in the motor cortex, right? They have a difficult time doing that. So let's watch Broca's aphasia here quickly, and we'll see what that example was like.
So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
You're 19. 19.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what happened to you?
Stroke. School and English class.
Okay.
And I book and I read it aloud. But I can't because stroke.
And what happened after the stroke with your speech?
Well, I can't.
What do you do now? Every day?
Oh, speech, then, the speech.
Therapy?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also riding.
Riding what?
Horses.
Yeah, good. And how do you feel?
I'm fine.
You're fine. That's good.
So Sarah Scott is a 19-year-old girl who had a stroke, obviously in English class while she was reading a book aloud. But you can tell, right, you can kind of piece together what she's trying to say, but her speech is broken because she's unable to actually produce speech in more than like one word fragments, right? The meaning is generally there, and in her brain, she understands what she's trying to say. It's just the actual physical production of that speech that gets damaged and is ineffective when she's trying to clarify what happened with her. And with that said, then we're going to look at this example of Wernicke's aphasia. This guy's name is Byron. He's on a cruise, and you're going to see it's not so much the actual production of speech that's difficult for him. It's the coherence and the meaning semantics behind trying to put words together to make any sense. So here, watch this, Byron, and I dare you to not smile because he's the cutest thing ever.
Hi, Byron. How are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck, for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was very good and happy. And I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to saying?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Okay, so cute, right? But again, right, we don't understand what he's saying. We could not distinguish the coherence and the meaning behind what he's saying, and that's a typical sign of Wernicke's aphasia, right? The production of and like coherence of organized, meaningful speech and the lack thereof when you have Wernicke's aphasia. So those are the two examples there. I do want to bring this conversation kind of back to how we started language with Swearing Day and the Swearing Day activity that you did. Obviously a little bit modified from what we would have done in class, but still interesting. And it's really, really interesting to recognize. I have an article here that we sometimes read. I'm not going to have you read it today. I'll just kind of give you a rundown of it. But essentially, what it says is that even people with both Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia or any other type of brain damage that might impact their ability to produce language are actually able to still effectively and efficiently curse. They can still swear. They still have this ability, right, to, if they stub their toe, they might say the S word. If they want to make a crass joke, they can do so. But even if they can't produce language, they can still swear in the appropriate context. And that goes to show, right, that swearing actually exists in a different part of our brain than the language production, like, abilities of our brain. And that's crazy because cursing is so tied to emotion and personality more so than it is to language, which again is crazy. So that's just a brief overview, but I did want to kind of tie it back to where this all started by looking at specific case studies. They have found that swearing exists separately from the ability to produce language. And with that, full circle yet again with this particular lecture slide deck. Do animals use language? Right? The Washoe the chimpanzee learned to use 245 signs to express what she wanted or noticed. Fellow chimpanzees learned the signs from each other without training and without rewards. We humans, I was going to say like we sent to New York Times, but I was not a part of this activity at all. The New York Times sent a deaf reporter to visit with Washoe, and she said, I realized I was conversing with a member of another species in my native tongue, which is crazy. And so it's important to kind of think about, again, language and thinking. Language versus meaning. Right? Can we associate and say that these chimpanzees were in fact using language? That's the question. Washoe seemed to combine words in new ways to convey meaning. Washoe used the phrase apple, which is orange, for an orange fruit. Chimps do not pick up words as easily as human children. Chimp word production lacks syntax, but bonobos, correctly understood, make the dog bite the snake. So these are just specific studies that have been done about language acquisition in primate species, but it's crazy to think about. And again, just goes to show like language versus meaning. The fact that the monkeys were able to look at an orange, not know the terminology for orange and say, that's an apple that is orange, right? That is creating new meaning, and therefore might lead us to believe that, in fact, chimpanzees can, in fact, use language. So with that, I will leave you. We're going to shift our attention starting tomorrow to look at intelligence. This will be the end of kind of our cognitive psychology unit and chapter in the textbook. You do have a formative to complete today that's going to look at language acquisition stages, as well as the differences between Wernicke's and Broca's aphasia. So take some time to do that and have an amazing rest of your day. Later, team.